request about air passenger duty.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes general questions. Before we come to First Minister's questions, members will wish to join me in welcoming to the gallery the Vice President of the Senate and the First Vice President of the House of Representatives of the Parliament of Bolivia, Nelida Cifuentes and Lucio Marca Mamani. Thank you. That brings us to the next item of business, which is First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements is planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
In private, the Finance Secretary John Swinney, in a paper to Cabinet, we remember that very rigorous piece of work, questioned the affordability of the state pension in a separate Scotland. This week, in public, John Swinney promised not just a state pension, but one guaranteed to go up by at least 2.5% a year, but said nothing.
Order.
It's easy to say it, but he said nothing about the age of retirement. Can the First Minister explain how John Swinney got from questioning the affordability of pensions to this new policy? What is the cost of the new policy? And how will those costs be met?
First Minister.
Well, can I just point out that one of the key areas that the Government have brought forward is that the welfare spending in Scotland is less as a proportion of our national economy than it is over the UK at the present moment. And what that should tell Joanne Lamont is that the welfare budget is more affordable in Scotland than some people regard it as across the UK. But given the wholesale desertion of the cause of universal benefits of welfare policy by the Labour Party in recent weeks, the acceptance of the Tory plans from the Shadow Chancellor, I think this is the very last subject that Joanne Lamont should be commenting on. Can I just point out the triple lock guarantee? That's the guarantee to the triple locks at the present moment, which was what John Swinney put forward in Independent Scotland. I think is an excellent thing to give reassurance. But the whole basis of the triple lock guarantee is exactly that. It's a guarantee in terms of getting pensioners the best deal possible, which is what the SNP are committed to.
Joanne Lamont.
If the First Minister wanted to be credible, he could at least make an effort and answer the question. And he says, this is the last question I should ask. It's the first question that many pensioners and others across this country are asking. And you know, when I was studying my O-grade maths, I remember that you had to do the sums, show the workings before you reached the answer. And what John Swinney did this week was simply ditch what you said before and gave an answer with no credible workings at all. For whatever the real cost of this pension policy, we know that it has cost the credibility of John Swinney and now the Government itself. Because we live in the real world. In private, the Cabinet doubts the affordability of the state pension. If their public words are to have any credibility, surely they must be able now, today, to tell us how it will be afforded. I ask again, how did the Government move from questioning the affordability of the state pension to this new policy of guaranteed rises for all, and what will it cost?
First Minister.
Then perhaps this time that Joanne Lamont will appreciate the significance of the information that the Government have published demonstrating that the welfare budget as a proportion of Scotland's national wealth is less proportionately than the welfare budget as a proportion of the UK, therefore making welfare more affordable in Scotland. And given the triple lock guarantee is current policy, until the Labour Party revised that as well, then of course we can put forward that for the security of old age pensioners in Scotland. Now, Joanne Lamont says this is the first question that pensioners would ask. I'll tell you what the first person that pensioners are asking in Scotland at the present moment. They're asking, is their bus pass safe if the Labour Party would return to power? They're asking about free personal care, because Joanne Lamont is not only unable, like Ed Balls, to commit to the current welfare budget, accepting the plans of the Tories, she is challenging the basic fabric of the achievements of devolution and the great gains for pensioners across Scotland.
Thank you, First Minister. Joanne Lamont.
On the bus pass, it helps to have a bus as well to go with it. You know, there are people across the country who believe that next year we're going to have a serious debate about the future of Scotland. From that showing, the First Minister is incapable of convincing anyone that he has even remotely thought about the things that really matter to families across the country. Now, we know why the First Minister can be so relaxed about pensions. By my reckoning, he's got 5, and they're all backed by the UK government. He's got his civil service pension, his MP's pension, his MSP's pension, his First Minister's pension, and we shouldn't forget,
Order. Order.
I am very grateful for the pension I have got, but we shouldn't forget, presumably, his Royal Bank of Scotland pension, and he should thank Gordon Brown for saving that one. So we know he will be all right, but he's prepared to put everyone else at risk. For pensioners now and in the future to believe that the SNP are suddenly so certain that the state pension is affordable, can the First Minister tell us now how much money he will have to raise to fund it and where it is coming from? Show us the workings, not just the answer.
Thank you. First Minister.
Firstly, I think pensioners watching this broadcast mentioning the words Gordon Brown, whose raid on pensions destroyed the pensions of people across this country, just indicates the insensitivity of the Labour Party. Let me try this again for Joanne Lamont. It's now accepted because of the workings that the Scottish Government has produced, that the share of the welfare budget as a share of Scotland's national wealth is less and therefore more affordable than the welfare budget across the UK.
Order.
Therefore, if the triple lock is affordable in
Mr.
the UK,
Kelly.
it's more affordable in Scotland. The triple lock is an essential part of the contract of society with pensioners, but other things are an essential part of that as well. I take from Joanne Lamont's question that the bus pass is in danger for the Labour Party. So let's hear it loud and clear. What did they say when they set up the Cuts Commission? Nothing is off the table. People should hear loud and clear, not just the bus pass, free personal care, tuition fees, the whole social contract of devolution is now under threat from the party which once cared, as said, about working people. No longer about working people or pensioners or anyone.
Order.
Hot foot in pursuit of their alliance with the Tory party.
Thank you. Joanne Lamont.
Well, my goodness. We have asked a simple question. He says it is evident. Share it with us. Share it with us what it will cost. And I think that any pensioner, any family worried about their children's future will look at this broadcast, as he calls it today, and wonder how it's possible for a First Minister to offer a future which does not simply be more than a leap in the dark on the fundamental issues facing families. And it is no wonder, not even his own SNP candidate in Aberdeen, Donside, believes there's a chance of the First Minister winning the referendum. Not even his own economic advisers find the First Minister credible. His Nobel laureate Joe Stiglitz says he's wrong on corporation tax. And only last night, Professor John Kay laid out why he's got his policy on the currency wrong. The Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland says there is £170 billion hole in his plans for private pensions, and the First Minister simply cannot tell us how he will afford the state pension. This is an absolute failure of office to be unable to answer those most basic questions. The reality is the First Minister has no credibility.
Order.
I'm glad you have something to laugh about, because for the rest of us, this is far from funny.
Order.
You know, if politics was about slogans and shouting, you would do fine. On something as something as fundamental as the future of this country, the First Minister has no credibility, no detail and no facts. Isn't the truth that the only way to protect your pension is to pension off Alex Salmond next September?
Thank you. First Minister.
Well, I guess Joanne Lambert didn't hear it properly. All it was suggested, her claim to have done O-grade maths, somebody merely suggested it should have been higher maths, and that was all. Now, let me try this again. The total wealth of Scotland, that's in the total product of Scotland, and the amount that's spent on welfare, that's less of a percentage in Scotland than it is across the UK. Thus far, is that correct? That is correct and accepted. Yes. Therefore, the affordability of that welfare budget, the dominant part of which is pensions, is therefore more affordable in Scotland than it is across the United Kingdom as a whole. That seems a reasonable position, and I think most higher grade maths students would probably manage to get there. Now, in terms of the pension black holes, then can I return to Mr Brown? The pension black holes that afflict the United Kingdom were created by Gordon Brown in his raid on the pensioners. And in terms of policy to pensioners, then what pensioners are looking for is guarantees on the bus pass. They're looking for guarantees and free personal care. This party gives these guarantees. In Labour, everything is up for grabs. And as far as Aberdeen Donside is concerned, not perhaps the Labour Party's strongest suit, because the parents in Middleton Park and Bramble Brae in Aberdeen Donside will be voting today to keep their schools open.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd like to ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
No plans to meet the Secretary of State in the near future.
Thank you, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. Yesterday, bereaved parents courageously came to this Parliament looking for support for a public inquiry into what happened to the remains of their babies and why. What started out as a scandal in a single crematorium in Morton Hall in Edinburgh has spread to crematoria in Glasgow and Aberdeen, and they're the ones that we knew about. But we've now learned that a number of families who used a facility in Falkirk have been affected, as have families using a private, not local authority crematorium. The government's response has been overtaken by events, so does the First Minister recognise that neither the Angelini investigation nor Lord Bonamy's review will give the answers the parents in Parliament yesterday need?
First Minister.
Can I first say that let's just accept that everyone in this Parliament has great sympathy and empathy for the parents in these circumstances. I suspect people across the country, my mother, and this is common with many families who had experienced this, had a stillborn child. If you add to that the extremity of not knowing about the disposal of a child's ashes, then every person, every human person understands how parents feel in that circumstances, or at least has the empathy to try and understand how parents feel. And that's shared across this entire Parliament. The question is, how best do we proceed to get parents the answer they need, and of course, importantly, to try and change the policy which has prevailed in the past perhaps, but nonetheless has prevailed, certainly in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and perhaps in other areas to a significant degree across Scotland. Now, first on the Bonamy Commission. Lord Bonamy just last week, with the backing of his Commission, has indicated that he is confident that he can make proper recommendations by the end of this year. If that's the case, and he says it's the case, then I think that would be a huge step forward. It would have the advantage for us that we'd be able to legislate next year to make sure this never happened again, as opposed, for example, to a public inquiry which the average length of one in Scotland is 3.5 years, and 2 that we've sanctioned haven't even finished at this stage. So that would be an asset if it were to be the case. If it weren't to be the case, and that couldn't happen, I wouldn't hesitate to take other measures, including the consideration of a public inquiry, if Lord Bonamy's confidence is not to be justified by events. And the second thing on Eilish Angelini's investigations, I have a letter sent to Michael Matheson from Eilish Angelini this week, where she points out, because this question has been raised, as whether her inquiries have been hampered in any way by the status of her independent investigation. She says, "My inquiries have not been hampered by the absence of powers of compulsion. I have not received any indication to date there will be any such issue." Now, if Eilish Angelini can get the answers to satisfy, hopefully, the vast majority of the parents of Morton Hall, then presumably the same sort of inquiry, the same sort of investigation, as set out by Lord Bonamy in his letter around local authorities last week, could affect the other areas of Scotland. Again, if that's not possible, if our former Lord Advocate does encounter obstacles and can't get to the truth, then I'd be the first person, just like on the Bonamy Commission, to reconsider the issue and to see if further steps have to be taken. But let's try and conduct this answer to the anguish of parents in a way that accepts every single member in this chamber feels empathy and understanding for the circumstances and plight they're in.
Thank you. Ruth Davidson.
I welcome the empathy, sympathy and understanding of the First Minister, but the First Minister knows that Lord Bonamy's Commission is not looking at individual cases. It will not give answers historically to what happened to parents who are in this situation in different parts of the country. The Angelini investigation may in Edinburgh, but it doesn't address what's happening elsewhere. And the idea that the Angelini investigation, which is happening in Edinburgh, could in some way be looked at or replicated in other local authority areas has been skewered this week by the Chief Executive of Glasgow City Council, George Black, who wrote this week to the head of the Glasgow Ashes Group saying, and I quote, "We believe that in order to find out the truth of what happened in individual cases, it would be better for there to be a nationwide inquiry rather than a host of individual local inquiries." The First Minister has repeatedly sidestepped calls for a public inquiry. 2 weeks ago, he told me that the priority was Lord Bonamy putting these new procedures in place. And 3 weeks ago, he said it was right that the local authorities look at this individually. But this scandal has now spread from one crematorium in one part of Scotland to multiple sites, both private and public crematoria, in at least 4 local authority areas. We have the parents, knowing how long it will take, still calling for an inquiry to find out what happened to their baby's remains. And we now have the head of Scotland's largest local authority saying the current approach isn't enough and he wants more. I have repeatedly said that this is not a party political issue and it shouldn't be. But there is no getting away from the fact that the only party that is not supporting the parents' calls for an inquiry is the SNP. And I don't think that the parents out there would particularly like to hear catcalls from in here. And the parents out there just don't understand it, and neither do I. The SNP demanded a full public inquiry into the Dunoon ferry. Why, First Minister, is the case of these bereaved parents less deserving?
Thank you. First Minister.
Well, let me try again. There are 4 public inquiries that this government has sanctioned in Scotland since we took office: the ICL inquiry, the fingerprint inquiry, the Penrose inquiry and the Vale of Leven inquiry. None of these are on trivial issues, and we certainly aren't having a public inquiry into the Dunoon ferry. The Thompson's solicitors, who represent some of the parents, are currently advocating 4 additional public inquiries in Scotland: the Baby Ashes inquiry, transvaginal mesh inquiry, a Legionnaires inquiry, a PIP implants inquiry. Now, I believe if in a major public issue only a public inquiry can get the answers and the justice that people deserve, then indeed I won't hesitate to sanction a public inquiry. But in this particular instance, we have the hope and belief that Lord Bonamy, who this week incidentally wrote to the local authorities around Scotland, including to George Black of Glasgow Council, setting out how a local authority can sanction inquiry and advising on guidance. The guidance includes conducting any investigations are conducted transparently, independently, objectively, are respectable and sensitive to the concerns of affected families. If that's possible for the Angelini inquiry in Edinburgh, then why on earth wouldn't it be possible for an inquiry in Glasgow? I don't understand why something can be done in Edinburgh but not done in Glasgow. But the Bonamy report, which will look at cases and is open to submission, is there to provide the guidance and regulations that we can now introduce to stop this happening again. And this could be done by the end of the year. He's confident he can report by the end of the year with the commission that he has and the expertise, including the 2 charities representing the bereaved in terms of the campaigns, in order to put forward these recommendations. If that can be done, it would be a great advance. If Eilish Angelini can, to the satisfaction of parents, get to the bottom of the individual cases affecting Morton Hall, then why on earth couldn't that be done elsewhere as well? But if neither of these things are the case, if Lord Bonamy is not able to come up with the recommendations that we can endorse as a Parliament to stop this happening again, if Eilish Angelini does at some stage encounter obstacles in her individual inquiries into individual cases and cannot command the confidence of a majority of parents, then I'll be the first person to say, in that circumstances, we have to go for a public inquiry or some other recourse. But the full expectation that I have at this present moment is that Bonamy will give us the recommendations to bring into legislation in Scotland next year to show that this won't happen again. And that Eilish Angelini, as our former Lord Advocate, should command the confidence of everyone when she says that she can conduct this investigation independently in Edinburgh. And if it can be done in Edinburgh, it most certainly can be done elsewhere in Scotland.
Thank you. Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
4 years ago, I joined families in the little settlement of Kinedder Park in West Fife against the proposals to extract coal from the neighbouring fields. We lost. Permission was granted. The residents were assured by developers that the industry had learned lessons of past failures, and after extraction the land would be converted into a local environmental resource. Operations have now ceased, leaving a huge hole and spoil heaps dwarfing the area. Those families at Kinedder Park have been let down, and thousands of families across Scotland, from Ayrshire through Lanarkshire, Midlothian to Fife, are suffering too. Mining companies were supposed to buy insurance bonds to pay for the land restoration, but there is a huge deficit with insufficient funds available to restore all the eyesores. Due to the scale of the problem, will the First Minister order an independent inquiry into this failure?
First Minister.
Well, I think the first task and job to be done is what Fergus Ewing is doing at the present moment, and that's doing everything he can, firstly, to preserve employment in the open cast industry, and also to secure, with the support of local authorities, the necessary environmental clean-up. Can I just say to Willie Rennie, of course, yes, it is true, and I actually agree with his description about the bonds that were meant to be provided for. I hope and believe that when we have legislative control over such matters in this Parliament, then we'll make sure that these things are enforced, because it is surely part and parcel of what we should do in this Parliament, is to make sure that not just jobs are protected, but communities are protected as well.
Willie Rennie.
I welcome the First Minister's understanding of this, but actually local authorities do have the powers just now to enforce appropriate restoration bonds. It's not as if they are deprived of the powers that would suddenly resolve this problem. And it refers to the work of Fergus Ewing, and I commend him for the work he's doing on the Coal Task Force. But that's primarily looking at the needs of the business side. The Restoration Trust that is proposed as well, it's got no real bite, and is proposing, in fact, more lenient alternative to restoration bonds for the industry, risking further environmental problems in the future. While some companies have made millions, communities have been left environmentally bankrupt. The industry is now seeking to dump open casts for other people to clean up. Kinedder Park is one of them. Communities have endured years of noise, dust and heavy transport, and they now fear a legacy of derelict sites, polluted water and scarred landscapes. I would encourage him, I would urge him to set up that independent inquiry, as communities were promised that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, but they were. For the sake of the families at Kinedder Park and many others, will the First Minister act?
First Minister.
Well, first I'm extremely sympathetic on this issue, but let's just consider his statement about what local authorities can and can't do. Then the environmental powers of local authorities mean very little if the company concerned has gone out of business. There are no assets to chase in that position, which is exactly why the provisions about posting bonds and having that fund available is of such great significance, and these are the powers that I was referring to. I don't think reasonably any reasonable person could blame East Ayrshire Council or Fife Council for not being in a position to chase money that is no longer there. Secondly, in terms of the Restoration Fund and that aspect which Fergus Ewing has been pioneering, it is simply untrue to say that Fergus Ewing's been solely concerned for the jobs in the industry, which is incidentally a very legitimate objective. He's also been concerned through the Restoration Fund to try and help the situation. But can I say to Willie Rennie, he actually makes the case I would make, that if you're going to pursue an industry which can potentially leave people with such environmental damage, then you have to have the legislative framework which makes sure the funds to restore that is independent of the corporate entity itself. And I look forward to he and I drafting that legislation when this Parliament has the powers to do it.
Question number 4, Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what discussions the Scottish Government has had with the security services regarding the emergency landing at Prestwick Airport on the 15th of June 2013.
First Minister.
Well, I'm pleased to say that Police Scotland kept the Scottish Government fully informed of the developments following the diversion to Prestwick Airport of Egypt Air Flight MS985. Police Scotland met the plane on arrival at Prestwick Airport. 100 officers of the Specialist Crime Division undertook a controlled disembarkation of the plane, searched the plane, interviewed all the passengers and crew before the flight continued to New York. I think, among other things, this incident highlights the strategic importance of Prestwick as an airport with the facilities necessary to receive high-risk flights involving the potential for hijacking or terrorism. And therefore, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice has written to the UK Secretary of State for Home Affairs this week, highlighting that vital, that huge role that Prestwick played in this latest incident, and commending, of course, as we all should, the multi-agency response led by Police Scotland.
Chick Brodie.
I thank the First Minister for his very comprehensive answer. This, as he said, incident highlights the importance of Prestwick Airport not only to Scotland, but to the aerospace industry, specifically as a travel and a maintenance, repair and overhaul airport, as well as a resilience airport for military and anti-terrorist purposes. Yet it, along with other Scottish airports, would be neglected by the London Coalition's £50 billion+ new airport obsession for the south east of England. Does the First Minister agree that we should have an independent and comprehensive air and airport strategy for Scotland to include more international direct flights to Scotland that will start to take effect post-Independence Day in 2016?
First Minister.
The obsession of the Westminster Government is causing most damage to Prestwick and other airports and connectivity in Scotland is the obsession with air passenger duty and the discrimination that places against the airports of Scotland, indeed the airports of the northern regions of England as well, and the devolution of air passenger duty to this Parliament to take effective action to increase connectivity in Scotland, I think actually was supported, certainly by majority, and I think very large majority in this Parliament. And I hope the Tory Labour alliance in the Better Together haven't lost their enthusiasm for saying air passenger duty devolve to this Parliament so as we can take effective action on behalf of Prestwick and the other airports of Scotland.
Question number 5, Graham Pearson.
To ask the First Minister what impact the recent decision by 3 senior executives to leave the Scottish Police Authority will have on its IT strategy.
First Minister.
Well, no reason to believe there will be any impact. The official responsible for the delivery of the Scottish Police Authority's IT strategy is its Chief Information Officer and not one of the 3 people to leave their interim roles at the SPA. The authority continues to be led by an able, skilled and experienced board.
Thank you. Graham Pearson.
The First Minister talked previously of created tensions across Scottish policing. With the loss of the Head of Finance, Head of Governance and Strategy and the Accountable Officer for the Scottish Police Authority, the Chief Executive Officer, it's clear that the factors behind the crisis are more than creative tensions. Will this week's meeting of senior officials to reorganise governance responsibilities across Police Scotland and the authority finally indicate the Government is coming to grips with this taxpayer-funded £1 billion organisation and deliver on a single, efficient, single police force?
First Minister.
Well, I don't think we should question the efficiency of the Police Service of Scotland, given that recorded crime in this country is now a 39-year low. Thanks to the commitment and officers of the Police Service of Scotland, up 1,262 officers since this government took office. Thank goodness that these officers are in place, policing our communities safely. Now, in terms of the IT, which was Graham Pearson's position, I think it's important for him to know, because he has expressed concern about this in the past, not just that the accountable officer is not one of those interim appointments leaving the Scottish Police Authority, but also that the I6 programme is a potential solution to the challenges of dealing with the legacy of having so many separate boards. And I think Graham Pearson himself has pointed out the lunacy of not having IT systems across Scotland that couldn't communicate with each other. So that I6 proposal for the acquisition of the single ICT system for the police service to cover recording, management, analysis of data and crime, vulnerable persons, criminal justice, custody, missing person and property is a major advance. And I'm pleased to say that discussions with the SB indicate the estimated total cost of £45 million over 10 years is affordable within their existing budget. Indeed, I believe, in fact I know, that the SPA board will be considering this proposal next week on the 26th of June.
Thank you. Question number 6, Christian Allard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what plans does the Scottish Government have to commemorate the 25th anniversary of Piper Alpha?
First Minister.
Well, Piper Alpha remains the world's worst offshore platform disaster, and the events of 25 years ago remain etched in the memories of those of us who are old enough to remember. The Government is setting out and has set out a range of ministerial involvement at the very important activities that are taking place over the next 2 weeks, including the Offshore Safety Conference, the screening and premiere of the film Fire in the Night, which I think is a hugely effective film and also hugely important in bringing to a new generation both the horror of Piper Alpha and the absolute importance of seeing that it doesn't happen again. The Pound for Piper Memorial Trust appeal is raising funds to ensure that the families and others affected by Piper Alpha have that peaceful place to remember their loved ones for years to come. We were able to contribute to that appeal, but I commend the efforts of the Pound for Piper campaign in giving the bereaved families an appropriate place to remember their loved ones in Aberdeen.
Thank you. Christian Allard.
I thank the First Minister for that answer, and I would like to take this opportunity to highlight the screening of Fire in the Night this Friday in Aberdeen at the Belmont Picture House and its wider distribution in the weeks ahead. Would the First Minister join me in welcoming this feature-length documentary as an important testimony of the terrible events for generations to learn from?
First Minister.
Yes, I would. I think Fire in the Night has great importance for a new generation, and to make sure, and I hope and believe, we can make sure that every school child in Scotland has access to the information contained in that film. It's really important that people remember Piper Alpha in terms of the critical nature and importance of safety in the North Sea. But it's not just, of course, the children and young people in Scotland who have to remember this. We have to think that many offshore workers weren't alive when Piper Alpha disaster happened 25 years ago. And therefore the initiative to have a special safety film screened to every single offshore worker to remind people why they've got the permit to work system, why they've got the safety case system that Lord Cullen recommended and was introduced after Piper Alpha as one of his 106 recommendations. To remind why these systems are in place is of crucial importance. Also in terms of public obligation is the necessity to make sure that the Coast Guard is properly manned, that the offshore safety considerations are properly organised, because these are part of the public infrastructure. That's our commitment to make sure that offshore workers working inevitably in the most hazardous of environments are properly protected.
Thank you, First Minister. That concludes questions to the First Minister, and I will allow a short pause for members who are not participating in the next business debate to leave the chamber and for the public gallery to clear before we move on to members' business. Could I ask guests who are leaving the public gallery to do so as quietly as possible?